Hi, this is Lane 8492. This is the only true crime video I'm doing today. This one would be on probably one of the worst breaks that happened in United States history. This took place in 1984. It was called the Mecklenburg Six up in the state of Virginia. See, the Mecklenburg Six, this is when six prisoners broke out of the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility. What was even scarier is that all six of these prisoners were on death row in Virginia. This was at the time when Virginia had the death penalty, which would eventually be repealed in 2021. What it appeared at first was that six prisoners dressed in riot gear were apparently using a fire extinguisher to extinguish a bomb that was believed to be in the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility, and they thought that was the end of the nightmare. But it turned out it was a nightmare that was really about to start and come to life, because it turns out those six in riot gear were not corrections officers. All six of them were prisoners on death row. And when they learned that six death row inmates are running loose, it was a nightmare come to life, to where they would have to gather help from local, state police, and even the FBI to have these six death row inmates apprehended. They interviewed the correctional officers because they felt, being that correctional officers don't get paid too well and that campus PD receive better pay, they thought they were susceptible to bribes, but it turns out that wasn't the case. They just didn't use proper judgment. But what they would learn in 1984, that tensions were at an all-time high since the execution of Frank Coppola. You see, Frank Joseph Coppola, he was a former police officer who was convicted of beating a woman to death during a robbery. After 5 years on death row in Virginia, Coppola decided, despite proclaiming his innocence, that he did not want to fight his death sentence anymore, and resigned to his fate. And on August 10th, 1982, at the age of 38, Frank Joseph Coppola was the first one in Virginia to go to the electric chair, which they were using at the time. But during his execution, something went awry. Frank Joseph Coppola's head and leg caught on fire, and a cloud of smoke filled the execution chamber at the old Virginia State Penitentiary, where executions were carried out until after 1990. And Frank Joseph Coppola was a prisoner who the other death row inmates looked up to, and as one said, he was the first one to go to the chair. So prisoners were planning to escape. Now, the one who would make homemade weapons for them, he was considered a genius at making homemade weapons. His name was Willie Lloyd Turner. You see, Willie Lloyd Turner was convicted of shooting a jewelry store owner, William Jack Smith, during a robbery of his store. He never finished the 6th grade and learned to read and write in prison and was sentenced to death. But he remained behind for a reason I'll later explain. But these were the 6 prisoners who escaped from Mecklenburg Correctional Facility. The first 2 were the Briley brothers. Linwood Earl Briley, he was convicted of shooting a DJ, Johnny Gallagher, during a robbery. His younger brother, James Dyrrell Briley, who was convicted of killing a family of 3. Harvey Barton Sr., his wife, Judy Barton, and their 3-year-old and their son, Harvey Barton Jr. And of course, the Briley brothers, they ran a vicious gang in Richmond, Virginia, to where they may have killed 11 to 20 people. So they were the worst. Then there's Lem Davis Tuggle. He had raped and murdered 2 women in separate incidents. Then there was Earl Clanton Jr., his crime. He was convicted of murdering an elementary school librarian, Wilhelmina Smith, after he had just been paroled for the murder of an elderly woman in New Jersey. And then there's Willie Leroy Jones, his crime. He shot an elderly couple, Brandon and Myra Adkins, after breaking into their home to rob it. And he asked the wife to pray for him before Jones shot the couple and set their house on fire. And then there was Derek Lynn Peterson. His crime, he shot a grocery store owner, 45-year-old Howard Kaufman, after robbing his grocery store that would result in a loot of $6,000 in cash and checks. They had no idea where they were heading. They had taken a prison van and then they would split up. And the first two to be apprehended would be Earl Clanton Jr. and Derek Lynn Peterson. They had changed out of their correctional officer uniforms for sweatpants and were found at a laundromat getting ready to eat cheese and drink wine in the sleepy town of Warrenton in North Carolina. They were the first two to be apprehended after being on the run for 19 hours and no sleep. 10 days after the escape, the next two escapees would be found hundreds of miles up north in Vermont, Lim Davis Tuggle and Willie Leroy Jones. And they were in Vermont. They were just a few miles from the Canadian border, but the truck that they had stolen, the pickup truck that they'd stolen, was apparently nearly out of gas, and Jones and Tuggle were out of money. So that's when Lim Davis Tuggle asked for a soda at a souvenir store and ended up robbing the place of $80. And the clerk got the license plate, which determined it was involved in a prison break in Virginia. And that would lead to the apprehension of Lim Davis Tuggle by a Vermont state trooper and an off-duty constable. And of course, Willie Leroy Jones, he would turn himself in when he was just about maybe a few miles from the Canadian border. And then 19 days after the escape, Linwood Earl Briley and James Dyro Briley would be apprehended in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, what led to this was that Earl Clanton Jr. Some inmates asked to go in early, which is against procedures, which weren't being followed. So that took a couple of officers off the rotation. Then they did a scuffle to distract the remaining correctional officers, and that allowed Earl Clanton Jr. to hide in a correctional officer's bathroom. And they waited for another death row inmate, Giartano, to pass a book, and that's what led them to strike, to where they took correction officers hostage, took some of their money, and they took correctional officer uniforms and even some riot gear. But after the escape, a lot of people were going to be in big trouble at this prison, because Virginia's then governor has announced that 5 correctional officers have been fired. The warden and his security assistant were both suspended without pay. And after an independent investigation by 3 independent consultants, they learned that the conditions at that prison, with the way they were run, were unacceptable. And of course, a few months later, the director of the Department of Virginia Corrections resigns, but he puts in new changes. Doors to all correctional officers' bathrooms are locked all the time. Open stairways are boarded up so they cannot plot their plans with that. And the sally port being that both doors were open simultaneously, despite it being against procedures, they put in an interlock so that won't happen again. When he was apprehended, Linwood Earl Briley said, "At least I had my 19 days." Well, in October of 1984, Linwood Earl Briley is the next one to go to Virginia's electric chair. Then in 1985, his younger brother, James Dyro Briley, was the next one to go to the electric chair. Then in 1988, Earl Clanton Jr. is the next one to go to the electric chair. Then in 1991, Derek Lynn Peterson, one of the first 2 escapees to be apprehended, was next to go to the electric chair. Then in 1992, Willie Leroy Jones, who had turned himself in when he was just a few miles from the Canadian border, is the next one to go to the electric chair. Then in 1995, Willie Lloyd Turner, the one who stayed behind, it's because he had an appeal pending, and he felt if he had joined the escapees, he would have screwed that whole deal up. So he put his faith in the system, and that didn't age well for him. And in 1995, he was executed. By this time, Virginia had numbered the days of the electric chair. But despite that, 7 more prisoners would go to Virginia's electric chair by their choosing. And those prisoners would be Kenneth Manuel Stewart Jr. in 1998, Michael David Claggett in 2000, Earl Conrad Bramblett in 2003, Brandon Wayne Hedrick in 2006, Larry Bill Elliott in 2009, Paul Warner Powell in 2010, and Robert Charles Gleason Jr. in 2013. And of course, in 1995, Willie Lloyd Turner is executed by lethal injection. And they said about an hour after the lethal drugs had permanently stopped Turner's heart, his lawyers found a homemade 32 caliber loaded handgun in the typewriter of his cell, along with a typewritten note that only said one word: smile. And then in December of 1996, the last surviving escapee, Lem Davis Tuggle, is executed by lethal injection. And of course, that's how Willie Lloyd Turner was executed. Of all those involved in this plot, Joseph Giartano, whose book passing was the signal to strike, got his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. He has since been paroled and has eventually passed away. And the last one to be executed in Virginia would be William Charles Morva in 2017, who was convicted of shooting a deputy and a security guard. 4 years later, Virginia abolished the death penalty, which they no longer use today. And of course, the Mecklenburg Correctional Facility has since been closed and bulldozed. Well, hope you enjoy this video and let me know what you think. Thanks.